Good evening, everyone. My name's Vince Tropiano. With me is Cliff Chang. We're tax partners with Grant Thornton here in Sydney. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. We're here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. Not too long ago, Dr. Jim Chalmers finished presenting the budget for this year, had a number of focus areas. He talked about it being an inflation fighting and future making budget. Big focus around small business, individuals and grants and incentives for renewables. Big highlights around future made in Australia and housing support for Australians. Big highlight for him was a $9.3 billion surplus. Sadly, that will extend to a $28.2 billion deficit next year, driven substantially by the cost of living relief, which was announced tonight. Net debt scheduled to be around $500 billion. Some of the priorities he highlighted was the helping the cost of living, building more homes for Australians, investing in a future-made Australia, including development of skills and supporting universities and university education, strengthening Medicare and the care economy, tax cuts for everyone, wage growth, energy bill relief, an economic plan where growth and opportunity go together, and reducing inflation through responsible cost of living measures. Cost of living, as I said, was a big ticket in tonight's budget. So the Treasurer highlighted tax cuts for all taxpayers, picking up on the stage 3 cuts. It's the biggest part of the cost of living package. 13.6 million taxpayers get a cut. For 84% of taxpayers, the Treasurer outlined that this is a better tax cut than under the previous government. New power bill relief for people and small business. $3.5 billion in new energy bill relief from 1 July, $300 energy rebate for every household, $325 rebate for 1 million small businesses. You're looking at freezing the cost of medicines, $3 billion for cheaper medicines, freezing PBS prescriptions for everyone, $3.4 billion to add medicines to the PBS. He's talked about it early in the week regarding debt relief for students, capping indexation to either CPI or WPI, whichever is lower, backdating this to mid-2023, which is an average saving of $1,200 per person, and also wiping off $3 billion in student debt. Supporting renters, $1.9 billion to increase maximum rates of Commonwealth rent assistance, and building more homes was a big part of tonight's budget. Within the next 5 years, aim is 1.2 million new homes, 6.2 billion in new investments, 30.2 billion in homes for Australians. The other big ticket tonight was Future Made in Australia initiatives, investing in that to encourage onshore manufacturing, a $22.7 billion package, attracting investment in key industries, making the country a renewable energy powerhouse. 13.7 billion in production tax incentives for green hydrogen and processed critical minerals. 1.7 billion for a Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund, 520 million to deepen net zero trade. There's a lot of money spent on defence capability, some $300 billion, and supporting small business to transform the economy, extending the instant asset write-off, 20,000 until 30 June 25, providing 290 million in cash flow support for 4 million small businesses. There was funding there for women's equality and opportunity, an extra 925 million to establish permanent leaving violence program. That's a total of 3.4 billion to address violence against women, and providing 1.1 billion to pay super on government parental leave. The Treasurer talked about responsible economic management, easing the pressure on Australians while investing in the community, the economy and the future, strengthening the budget and paying down debt, and again highlighting the expected surplus of 9.3 billion, which is the first back-to-back surplus in 2 decades. There are a number of main spending highlights. 3.5 billion energy bill relief, as I mentioned, 22.7 the Future Made in Australia, 3.2 billion over the next decade through the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, 1.7 billion the Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund, 13.7 billion critical minerals production tax incentive and green hydrogen, 91 million to accelerate development of clean energy workforce, 1.9 billion to increase rent assistance, 19.7, as I said, to accelerate investment in future made in Australia priority industries, waiving student debt of $3 billion, $6.2 billion new housing investment. As I said, tax cuts for everyone. Under the government tax cuts rates, 19% rate will be reduced to 16. The 32.5 rate will be reduced to 30. Income threshold above which the 37% tax rate apply will be increased from 120 to 135,000. The 45% tax rate will kick in now from 200,000 up from 180. This is estimated to reduce tax receipts to the government by $1.3 billion over the next 5 years, which will add to the increase in the deficit over the next few years. So a number of measures designed to improve Australian investment in manufacturing, improve housing opportunities. The Treasurer spoke a lot about reducing inflation down to a target rate of between 2 and 3%, despite all this relief that's been given. I might bring Cliff in. Cliff, given what we've heard tonight, do you think that the Treasurer's got it right in terms of what his goals might be?
Yeah, we've heard a lot of the media buzz these past few days around the two I words, inflation and interest rates. So what was really interesting, as you mentioned out, Treasurer predicts inflation's going to fall to that sweet spot of 2 to 3% by the end of December, which is actually 12 months before the RBA's forecast, just a week ago. 12 months is a lot of time, and it's a big difference between the forecasts, but I think two major things I want to point out before diving into some of the measures that underpin that. First thing is we've had a few state budgets and the federal budget itself handed down since that time. The second thing is the RBA actually did mention consumption's dropped a little bit quicker than previously expected last quarter. So we are going to probably see an expectation where the cost of living pressures are going to be sustained over the next 12 months. That's generally how you're going to get inflation back under control. But we are obviously seeing the measures that are designed to help cost of living, really for everyone, but with a particular focus on that lower to middle income tax bracket. So some of the highlights from my end, obviously keeping to the promise of the stage 3 tax cuts. Under the coalition, the tax cuts were originally designed to provide a larger proportional tax benefit to those in the higher income bracket. We're seeing those revisions under the Labor government skewing more towards the low to middle, supporting that we just talked about. Obviously, direct impact measures like the $3.4 billion or $3.5 billion in energy bill relief measures for households and small businesses alike. We've also got the $3 billion in freezing medicines, $3.4 billion to adding medicine costs, adding to medicines to circulation, but freezing of costs. Good news with students and loans, $3 billion that you mentioned that was wiped out of HECS debt. It's good news to my brother, who's probably still struggling with that, but sorry to call him out. He's not watching. But indexation was so high at 7.1%. I think the impact of that $3 billion is not going to be felt as much as your typical $3 billion stimulus. It was well above what we expected in that period. So I think it's a reasonable measure, and we do want to support the younger population. They are the future of our economy. Housing affordability was a big topic here. We're seeing some supply side incentives. So 1.2 billion new homes to be built by 2030. We're probably going to have to wait a bit of time before it has a huge impact on the rental market. It takes time for houses to be built, but I think it supports that current supply side pricing where we do want to see a little bit of a sustained period where the cost of living pressures are still there, alleviated for the short term for certain parts of the population, but we do want to achieve that lower inflation rate by a certain period, hopefully within 12 months as the government predicts. Specific relief measures on that front though, again, aimed at supporting that lower income tax bracket, $9.3 billion to support homelessness, crisis support and social housing, $1 billion to crisis and transitional accommodation for women and children, another $1 billion to support community infrastructure for roads, sewage, energy, water. Hopefully that expedites the building of the new homes. And a personal favourite, $2.3 billion in Western Sydney infrastructure, so I don't have to play dodgem cars on the way in and out of Parramatta on the way to work. I think it actually focuses more on realistically supporting the new commercial and residential infrastructure out there, but I'm hoping that I don't have to run into as many potholes on the way here. So a lot of that, we see measures that are aimed to support that lower income, middle income bracket, whilst we are going to maybe hopefully sustain and make it through this period of increased cost of living. One thing I do want to point out is you might hear a lot of negativity around spending during an inflationary period. If you do get your news source from outside this powerhouse media outlet we have at Grant Thornton, Australia, but the government can't spend nothing at all. So the question is always, how much is a reasonable amount of spend and where is it going to be placed. So what I am seeing here in this budget is, on a positive note, we're not hopefully putting too much burden on businesses to slow down productivity, and there is a fair bit of investment into what we're seeing is a renewable future. So there is a very clear Future Made in Australia message. There's a clear message to try and stimulate that production over the next longer term period, which is actually nice to see. The temptation typically is to see the government splash cash in the shorter term goals. So a longer term initiative is actually quite encouraging. But obviously the idea behind that, so 22.7 billion aimed at reviving local manufacturing, supporting renewable energy programs, that's going to see job creation at levels where we can hopefully actually maintain competitiveness with those that seem to be ahead in China and the US. Some of the highlights from that end, 13.7 billion in production tax incentives for green hydrogen and processed critical minerals, 520 million invested into net zero trade, 1 billion to increase the number of Australian-made solar panels, 566 million over 10 years for mapping of critical minerals underneath Australia's soil and seabed. So we're obviously seeing some support on the supply side of things. Interesting to note that it's still going to be investing in the future. So Labor's sticking to their promises pre-election as well as post-election. That's really, really good to see. You also mentioned the $20,000 instant asset write-off. So outside of the renewable space, just more in general, we are seeing some incentives for small businesses up to 4 million to get around 290 million in cash flow support. So I think it's encouraging signs that we're seeing some stimulus into the economy that hopefully sustain production whilst we can make it through a period of sustained increased cost of living. Also, I think the current rate of investment into Australia could be better, and we're seeing that, trying to stimulate foreign investment into the renewable space, whilst we do try to lift that value of the AED relative to US and Chinese currencies. So that in theory should lower the cost of imports over time and again support some period of lower cost of living, hopefully within 12 months.
It makes sense that this would be the time where we'd look to invest in the future made in Australia. Probably over the last few years there's been a big push, probably the last decade or so, and more so about being part of a global economy and trying to be competitive in a global economy. But obviously what we're seeing with a number of countries, some of our larger trading partners, is that there has been greater investment in nationalistic investment, looking after the local industry to the exclusion of some of the foreign industries. And I remember reading some stuff over the weekend where I guess the view was put that it's difficult for us to put our head in the sand and ignore that sort of thing, and we need to get into that similar sort of game. Yeah, so it makes sense that there's a number of these announcements regarding trying to develop Australian manufacturing, probably more so than may have been over the last 5 to 10 years. So I think that's an important development and something that we would certainly support. It's not all wine and roses. We did talk about the personal tax cuts hitting tax receipts for the government over 1.3 billion over the next 5 years. The other side of that is a number of small measures to maintain integrity of the tax system, which would impact on, corporate Australia. The multinational tax avoidance scheme, the program which is in place is now will be extended for another 2 years, ensuring that the ATO continues to be well resourced to pursue key tax avoidance risks, focus on multinationals, large public and private businesses and high wealth individuals. Estimate an increase in receipts by 2.4 billion and increase payments of tax by 1.2 billion over the next 5 years. Providing 180 million over the next 4 years to increase the ATO's ability to detect, prevent and mitigate fraud against tax and super systems. So there's still a lot of work being done there to ensure that while the government has lost revenue, tax revenue through its personal tax cuts, it's looking to ensure that it can continue to collect revenue through corporate tax state and reducing any fraud or evasion. Remembering, of course, that by far the biggest part of government tax revenue is personal income tax. Almost 50% is what the amount is at this point in time. So there's some more additions there in terms of integrity rules, which will mean more administration, making the tax system, for a couple of tax guys, making the tax system more complex for business. Did you hear or see anything there that's actually going to make life a bit easier for business from an efficiency perspective or administration or red tape perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit biased and stand on my little GST soapbox here. I always look for something to do with GST in the budget. Having said that, I had zero expectation there was going to be any overhaul of the GST system. Now, this is despite I think the fact that Australia is quite far behind in terms of the GST rate, it's 10%, obviously. OECD average is around 19 to 19.2%. There probably can be more efficiencies to be had in updating the GST system, whether you broaden the base, as you've all heard probably if you're tax nerds like me, or increasing the rate. That remains to be seen. But I think GST is obviously a consumption-based tax. It does put a bit of pressure around spending. It can be, in theory, an ideal time to do that, but I think the government's approach right now is rather than increase complexity over changes in larger federal tax systems, maybe it's by way of your traditional measures around stimulus and tax incentives. So I don't expect anything to happen in the near future, particularly as it can be quite tricky to predict what can happen to GST revenue and flow-on impact on economy, especially a consumption-based tax. But it would be nice to see that just in the horizon, given the multiple different taxes and levies that businesses have to really deal with, maybe in spite of the fact that maybe 70 to 80% of the revenue comes from income tax and GST. So hopeful, wishful thinking, but it's not surprised to not see anything there.
Thanks, Cliff. We might leave it there. I mean, over the next 6 to 12 months, it'll be really interesting to see what happens with these levers around inflation, potential impact on interest rates. The government still has another 12 months to run before it needs to go to the polls. Who knows where that will happen, whether it comes earlier in the new year or later this year. We'll wait and see what happens. This isn't the end of Grant Thornton's federal budget coverage. During the course of the evening, you'll all receive a copy of our federal budget newsletter. Tomorrow we will have 2 webinars. Firstly, the main, update webinar hosted by Network 10's Hugh Riminton, featuring St George Economist Besa Deda and Jared Grima, a Grant Thornton corporate finance partner. That'll be followed by another tax breakout session, a shorter tax breakout session, which will deal with a number of these specific tax measures, the R&D incentives that are included within here, and all the other tax initiatives that have been raised tonight. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and please join us tomorrow for the 2 webinars as they come through to you, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. Thanks very much and good night.
Thank you.